Talk about from Crimea leading up to 2021. What sh- should people have been so surprised at the invasion of Ukraine? What was the buildup there?
Well, look, I mean, I should hold my hand up beforehand and say, look, until about a week before the invasion, I thought it was no more than 30 to 40% likely because it did not make sense. And I'll sort of come to quite why. But yes, I mean, in terms of the progression, look, human beings are great engines of pattern recognition, sometimes where no pattern exists. So we have a tendency to think, well, he invades in 2022, he seizes Crimea in 2014, we should be able to draw a nice, neat, straight line. It's not like that. When he takes Crimea, he has no plans to do anything else beyond that. This is just about Crimea. But in some ways, because it's just so easy and so straightforward, it kind of creates its own momentum. Oh, we've got away with that. What else could we get away with? More to the point, at the same time, a whole bunch of other sort of agents and actors are themselves muscling in to a sort of a rising tension in southeastern Ukraine, in the so-called Donbass region, which has a large population of Russian-speaking Ukrainians. They're Ukrainian citizens, but nonetheless, they have a lot of family ties and everything else across the border with Russia. And they were not necessarily happy with what had happened in Kiev. They were worried that they were going to face a backlash from the Ukrainian speakers, all that kind of thing. And there are people who want to try and basically capitalize on this. And the thing is, again, we have a sense of the Putin regime as being something that's incredibly controlled and disciplined, as if it's some kind of modern equivalent of a sort of Bond villain Spectre type organization where sort of Putin sits there giving instructions. In fact, it's a lot more chaotic, and Putin is a lot more lazy. And often he's willing to give people a certain amount of free leeway without actually committing, just to see what happens. And he's willing to basically allow the sort of those figures who are trying to basically stir up a rising, a mutiny in the Donbass until he more or less feels that he's committed to it. It's a sunk cost fallacy that you sort of think after a certain point you think, well, I can't really let this go. When in fact it looks like the Ukrainian forces, which have kind of got their act together, are going to be in a position to retake control against these various sort of rebel groups, he feels, no, I can't allow that to happen. And in summer of 2014, we see Russian forces being sort of deployed, denied, but deployed to actually sort of basically stop that from happening. So you have this conflict that rolls on from 2014 onwards. And this is not really about the Donbass. Putin doesn't care about the Donbass. This is just simply about a way of trying to cause trouble for Kyiv, to try and teach Kyiv a lesson and get them to think, as Putin would see it, that they must realize that actually their destiny is to be part of Russia's sphere of influence. So stop all this messing around with the West, come back into the fold and recognize your place, which the Ukrainians clearly were not willing to do. But nonetheless, it means you have this rolling, undeclared conflict. And I think again, after a certain point, Putin comes to think, well, no, this is not acceptable. I mean, I either win or I lose.
Yeah. Everything's been so easy for him up to this point as well,
Yeah,
too.
exactly. And look, Putin, I mean, he clearly has an extraordinary blind spot when it comes to Ukraine. He does not believe Ukraine is a real country. He thinks of it more as a sort of annex to Russia. Historically, it's a very kind of complex relationship. But nonetheless, he doesn't think Ukraine's a real country. He doesn't think the Ukrainians are a real people. And he clearly doesn't actually think that if push comes to shove, they'll be willing to fight. And he convinces himself of that. And look, it may well prove that this will have been the first COVID war, shall we say. Because clearly the COVID era sees him go into very deep isolation. The circle of people around him, which have been shrinking anyway and becoming more and more people who are ideologically the same as him and just general yes men, but it shrinks much more dramatically. And he comes out of that seemingly sort of convinced that basically his legacy is dependent on breaking Ukraine's will to continue to defy Moscow. And you have basically sort of a process from about 2021, spring 2021, a steady build-up of troops on Ukraine's borders. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he planned to invade. Because here's the irony. Right up to the point when he actually launches his invasion, Putin was winning. He had this huge force on Ukraine's borders. These troops are on Russian or Belarusian territory. But nonetheless, under the shadow of Russian guns, investors were fleeing Ukraine. The Ukrainian economy was tanking. And the West was worried about the risk of war. So you had a constant stream of high profile visitors going to Moscow, putting Putin in exactly the position he likes to be, one of centrality where the supplicants come and beg something from him. And some European countries, I'll spare their blushes by not naming them, but were clearly putting quite a lot of pressure on Kiev to make some concessions to Moscow just to make the threat of war go away. So, if Putin really had been this geopolitical mastermind, we're sometimes told, he would have let that continue. But I think in part he was impatient. But also, look, he, again, didn't believe that Ukraine would resist. See, up to now, his secret has always been to pick easy fights. And this is why I was so perplexed about the prospect of war. Because I'm thinking, surely he can't be so stupid as to think that a country of more than 40 million people, a country that spent the last 8 years expecting and preparing for a Russian invasion, he can't think this is going to be a pushover. But the irony is that the very people who were most bullish about the fact that the Russians would invade, and that's particularly, and we're obviously particularly talking about the sort of American think tank close to the government sort of community, were also the ones who seem to be most bullish that 2 weeks and it'll all be over, which is clearly what Putin was thinking. He thought that basically he could roll in, they could quickly seize Kiev. President Zelensky of Ukraine would either flee or be arrested or be killed. A new puppet government could be installed. Yeah, there'll be some trouble. There's a whole few holdouts that have to be eliminated. There'll be some protests, and it's worth noting that a large proportion of that initial invasion force were not actually troops, but National Guard, sort of paramilitary security forces, right, glorified riot police, precisely because that's what he thought he would face: riots, not warfare. But basically, he too seemed to have thought that 2, 3 weeks and basically it'll be a done deal. So, from my point of view, I was thinking Putin wouldn't invade because it would be a hard fight. Putin ultimately invaded because, as far as he convinced himself, and no one was willing to disabuse him of this view, that it would be easy, and therefore almost why wouldn't you invade in that case?